was born and raised in Oregon, and was a big and charismatic man with the body of a wrestler and the roughness of a wild man of the woods. On top of that, he was also gifted with a brilliant mind and a writing talent, and in 1958 he was granted a scholarship to learn creative writing at the Stanford University in San Francisco. As he got there, Kesey mingled with the bohemian crowd in the vibrant city, became familiar with the beatniks, then centered in North Beach, and even planned to write a book about them. But fate intervened and offered him another plan, when in 1959, in order to make a living, he volunteered to be one of the subjects in a scientific experiment. The experiment was financed by the CIA, which sought to examine the warfare possibilities of drugs, and it exposed Kesey to several synthetic drugs that were yet unknown to the general public. These drugs generated different reactions in him, both good and bad, but one drug in particular had an effect that changed his world, and consequently, our world too. The name of this drug was LSD. When LSD first infused Kesey's mind, he felt as though his senses grasped reality in its fullness. The boundaries between him and the world were dissolved. Everything began swirling and forming in fantastic patterns, and he was floating at the heart of happiness. From that point of view, the scientists who were interrogating him and asking him to define the experience in objective terms seemed ridiculous and pathetic. People were trying to foist boundaries on a unified universe, to impose exact mathematical terms on an ever-flowing existence. Kesey felt that he found the key to happiness, and that the scientifically oriented Western society is based on a lie. From here on, the psychedelic experience will be the center of his world. LSD, Kesey felt, is much too important to be left in the hands of the army, the CIA, and the scientists. It can be used for a more vital role, such as bringing ecstasy and joy to the world. Since the drug was not illegal, there was no problem to use it privately, and Kesey found a way to get a supply. He began throwing parties in his home, offering his beatnik neighbors a drug that was much more potent than the cannabis they used to smoke, a new type of experience. The beatniks, who from the start regarded this wild outdoorsman as an outsider, were mostly dismissive of what he offered them. But some dug it, and slowly his circle began to grow. But Kesey still needed money, so when the experiment was over, he found a new source of income as a watchman in a psychiatric ward. And there, in the bowels of 50's medical establishment, a picture was revealed to him that seemed to him like a reflection of the crooked structure of Western society, and the outcomes it leads to. The ward, he felt, is doing the exact opposite of what it should be doing, and instead of trying to help the patients develop their personality and humanity, making them stronger and able to overcome what ails them, it administers scientific and technological tools that destroy their humanity. The book he was planning about the North Beach beatnik scene was scrapped, replaced by a new idea, a novel that will take place in a psychiatric ward and will be a parable to Western society. He wrote during his night shifts, sometimes high on LSD, and you can feel it in the parts of the book where we enter a state of hallucinations, which always yield insights about the structure of society and how it corrupts our human spirits. Kesey even managed to persuade one of the orderlies to give him an electric shock treatment, and described it through the mouth of the protagonist, a patient in the ward. Soon he completed his debut novel, and in 1962 he got it published. The book is called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and its hero is Randall McMurphy, a spontaneous, virile, mischievous and resourceful man. In short, he is full of life, and obviously much healthier than any other character in the novel, but he lives in a world where this type of health is considered a menace to society. His roughness gets him in trouble with the law and he is sent to prison, but his craftiness helps him replace the prison cell with a psychiatric ward, where he believes he will have a more comfortable incarceration. But when he gets there, he realizes that he made a bad deal, because in the ward he is only seemingly freer. The rules of the institution, presented at the beginning of the book by one of the doctors, are humane and enlightened rules sincerely aimed at helping the patients become healthier and happier. But the person who really rules the place is the head administrative nurse, the representative of bureaucracy, and she exploits these rules to her means. Her demeanor is always that of a compassionate angel, and she seems to care deeply for her patients, but her real goals are different. In her view, a healthy man is an adjusted man, a man whose will has been conformed to the collective will, and she acts to degrade the patients and turn them into human doormats, who would obey her completely and won't upset the perfect order by which she runs the place. The book doesn't hide that it is an allegory to the modern democratic society, in which man thinks that he is freer than in other societies, but in a way he is more oppressed, because the shackles are invisible. The mechanical punctuality that the head nurse tries to impose on the ward is an allegory to how we are all programmed to be cogs in the machine, obeying its rules and adjusting our will to what we are told is the general will. The power that the head nurse holds is absolute. To preserve the inmates in their docile condition, she keeps them constantly under the influence of sedatives, which they are compelled to take without being told what they are taking and for what purpose. None of the patients dares defy her, because she has the authority to decide if a person is healthy and can be released, or remain indefinitely in the ward. And if anyone displays any anger or resistance, she sends him to electric shock treatments. McMurphy is appalled by this trampling of the human spirit, and decides to fight back, but he knows that he can't win in a direct confrontation, so he chooses the way of cunning. He knows that as long as he doesn't break the rules, there's nothing she can do, since she must preserve the facade of a democratic institute that cares for its patients. So he launches a series of pranks and manages to make her lose her composure again and again. In this way he exposes her human weaknesses, undermines her angelic image, and breaks the hold she has over the minds of the other inmates. The novel eventually reaches a climax in a violent altercation between them, and a very bad end for McMurphy. But for most of the other patients it ends well, since under McMurphy's influence they develop a stronger personality, and are able to leave the ward as healthier people. The book was applauded by the critics and the public. Kesey's fame began to spread, and people began to flock around the writer on his drug parties. One of those people was Dr. Richard Alpert, Timothy Leary's partner, who dropped by to tell Kesey about the experiments and compare notes about the psychedelic experience. Another was none other than Neil Cassidy, the original Beat hero, who read the book and identified with McMurphy's vigorous character, and felt like Kesey was his spiritual brother. Kesey's circle began to expand, but his hope that the book will inspire a shift in the consciousness of people was dashed. It became apparent to him that the written word has lost its power to change the world, and that what was written in books is now read only by a certain crowd whose mind is already formed, and then placed on the shelf. To cause a social change similar to the change McMurphy brings to the world, he realized, he would have to find another way, more direct and with the ability to reach a larger audience. In mid-1963, Kesey's neighborhood was bought by a constructor and demolished, and he moved his quarters to La Honda, a sparsely populated place south of San Francisco. And there, in a cabin in the woods, he and his friends began to develop a new consciousness, based on a psychedelic experience. They did it through talking. While they were all under the influence, one would start talking, the next person would riff on what he said, a third would enter and embellish, and so forth, until they were all talking together and affecting each other, creating a kind of a hive mind, a mind that isn't driven by preconceived rules but regenerates itself at every moment, and remains tied to the present. It is basically a verbal version of the bebop experience, but without an audience of listeners. The experience here is only in the minds of the participants, as words come in from all directions and swirl in it, causing it to create its own words in response. To enhance the experience, they installed microphones everywhere and hooked them to tape recorders that would play them back in different delays, so what was said a few seconds earlier was also part of the mixture, and you could riff on the same theme once again. Out of this concoction, a new ideal was born. Henceforth, the life will be dedicated to perform pranks and provocations, which will expose more people to the experience and will make them want to join the joint consciousness. There was undoubtedly something of McMurphy here, a belief that pranks are the way to undermine the establishment. The name of the group was also born in these psychedelic sessions, and from here on they would be called the Merry Pranksters. They all assumed comic book style characters, created colorful psychedelic costumes for themselves, and set out to bring color and joy to the grey world of Western technocracy. But before we see how our heroes pranked the world, let's dally for a moment to summarize what we've learned about the psychedelic experience. As we've seen, there were two main ways in which the experience was interpreted, and both of them reached fruition in 1964, with the publication of Timothy Leary's first book and with the birth of the Merry Pranksters. Leary's approach is rooted in old traditions, while Kesey's approach is rooted in contemporary pop culture. They both agreed that the Western society of the mid-20th century is repressing the human spirit, and that the psychedelic experience is the key to liberation, but they understand liberation differently. They both believe that the experience connects us to the truth, but for Leary, truth is eternal and external to the human mind, whereas for Kesey, every moment has its own truth, that springs from the minds of contemporary people. For Leary, freedom means liberation from individuality, whereas for Kesey, freedom is a state in which the individuality expresses itself, and combines with other individuals to create a shared consciousness. And finally, Leary regards daily existence as a state of suffering which a psychedelic experience frees us from, whereas Kesey sees daily existence as a neutral state, and the psychedelic experience is a leap into a state of elation. As mentioned, Kesey reached the conclusion that the written word has lost its power, and he must seek another form of art if he wants to change people's minds. But before he made that observation, he managed to complete another novel, and in July 1964 it was scheduled to be in New York for its publication. The Pranksters, who were about a dozen people at this point, decided to turn the trip from California to New York into a shared experience that all of them will take part in. So they bought a school bus, painted it in psychedelic day-glow colors, wrote further on the destination sign, installed microphones and tape recorders all over, and placed a big tank of Kool-Aids packed with LSD in it. For Kesey, the bus became a symbol for the ideal world he saw in his mind, a world where everyone allows their will to flow spontaneously and their creativity feeds all the rest. As he defined it, one can either be on the bus, that is, part of the liberated hive mind, or off the bus, and the aspiration was to get as many people as possible on the bus and liberate them as well. The Pranksters also bought movie cameras to record their journey, and show the world the ideal life on the bus. And so, the Pranksters filmed their own version of On the Road, with Neil Cassidy once again in the role of the driver. In the many stops on the way to New York, they would play loud rock and roll music through the bus's loudspeakers and go outside to dance, amazing the crowds of onlookers that came out to see this weird and flamboyant bunch. When they got to New York, Kesey announced in the media that literature is an out-of-date art form, bound by the laws of grammar, and that he moved on. To the question of what is the art form that fits our time, he had two answers. First, the bus, which functions as a sort of an ongoing creation that moves through the world and performs as a stage for the journey of the human spirit. Secondly, the art of movie making, like the movie the Pranksters were shooting throughout their journey. The way he saw it, we are all living in a movie, whose script was written for us. The goal of the Pranksters was to write a new script, a happier one, and try to get the world to be part of it. From now on, along with wanting to get people on the bus, they will also talk in terms of getting people into the movie. And the Pranksters knew who they wanted to get into the movie first. In New York, after all, lived some of the people which they regarded as their spiritual fathers. First, they threw a party and invited Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, the founders of Beat. The success was partial. The open-minded Ginsberg got immediately into the movie, and integrated into the new spirit. Kerouac, in contrast, was dismayed by these grown-ups acting like clowns, with their comic book characters and rock and roll records, which he perceived as an erosion of the Beat spirit to the level of commercial pop. At heart he was still a novelist, still looking for high art, and he didn't want to be part of the movie. The bus left Kerouac behind, and in the years that passed until his death in 1969 he would be bitter and critical towards the culture that came out of his loins. From there, they got on the bus and drove to Millbrook to have a psychedelic summit with Timothy Leary and the League for Spiritual Discovery. True to the spontaneous nature of the endeavor, they did not inform Leary of the visit, so that there will be no script for the meeting but everything will be written on the spot. But when Kesey's circus entered the gates of Leary's estate, playing ear-splitting rock and roll and throwing color smoke bombs all around to announce their arrival, they got the cold shoulder from the somber group of scientists and mystics that dwelled in the place. The Pranksters disturbed the silence that they needed for meditation, and they didn't like that at all. Leary himself was in the midst of an important experiment, a 3-day-long psychedelic trip, and refused to leave it to welcome the guests. The Pranksters, too, felt alienated to the place and the air of seriousness that surrounded it, and felt that their hosts are a group of inhibited people, still bound by the consciousness they claimed to have liberated themselves from. In 1964, the two streams of psychedelia were simply too contrary to each other, and could not come together to create a collaborative movie. The Pranksters got back on the bus and returned west. Back in La Honda, the Prankster family kept growing, and they continued to develop a new consciousness from their joint experiences. The next insight emerged out of the aforementioned custom of using tape recorders that played back their words in delay. They started to think about the concept of time lags. Our consciousness perceives the world through our senses, and the senses present things to us a split second after they happen, which means that we don't really experience reality, but watch a movie about reality, a movie that documents what happened earlier. And there are other things that cause time lags. Our worldviews, based on our opinions and beliefs, are actually scripts that shape the way we perceive and understand reality. Each one of us has their own script, a script that is a combination of their perception and their worldview, and these scripts prevent us from being part of the flow of reality, turning us into spectators instead. Happiness, the pranksters claimed, is dependent on our ability to free ourselves of these scripts and live in reality, and psychedelic drugs are the means to achieve it. The universe, they believed, is made of bodies that are constantly moving in perfect synchronization, and enjoying being part of that synchronization. And so, anyone who manages to free themselves from the time lag and become part of this cosmic dance will be happy. That is also the reason that if you have several individuals who achieve liberation, they feel coordinated with each other, and their minds merge together. The universe, in other words, is an eternal bebop jam session, and we want to become part of that jam. The movie they filmed on the bus was supposed to document that ideal, but when they started editing it, they realized that what they filmed fails to capture the experience, and will not get the viewers into the movie. It turned out that movie making was also not the suitable medium to connect us to the truth, and they needed to find a different art form. And so, their attention was diverted back to the original medium that gave birth to the beat experience, back to music. But, of course, the music of this generation was no longer jazz but rock and roll. And if we're talking rock and roll, we're talking Beatles. In mid-1965, the Fab Four's second feature film was released, a movie called Help. The soundtrack was still based on the raw energy of rock and roll, but already displayed Bob Dylan's influence and the calming effect of pot smoking. The first movie, Hard Day's Night, which came out a year earlier, was a screwball comedy that reminded people of the Marx Brothers, and achieved great success. Help pretty much replicated the formula, but this movie is a lot more surreal, and those in the know got that the Beatles are definitely dabbling in drugs, although they have not discovered LSD yet. The Merry Pranksters got it too, and decided it was time to take the Beatles a step further, and get them into a new movie, their movie. On September 2nd, 1965, the Beatles were performing in San Francisco, and the pranksters decided that this is a good opportunity to get them into the movie and on the bus. They didn't know exactly how they were going to do it, but they believed that the universe will arrange something, since they were destined to get together. They got on their bus and drove to the event, but when they got there, they realized that they are facing a phenomenon that is bigger than them by several orders of magnitude. None of the screaming girls gave a fuck about them or the psychedelic bus. They had only Beatles on their minds. The concert itself scared them even more. It was nothing like the jazz performances they knew. Instead of a shared experience where every musician is an individual who feeds others and is fed by them, here there was a band that played as one unit, sending powerful electric waves into the audience, which reacted with wild squeals and was like a tumultuous ocean. The pranksters fled the place while they still could, and declared the venture a failure. But it also got them thinking. If the order of the universe is indeed like a bebop session, where every being does the thing but they are also synchronized together, then like in bebop, there always is the leading soloist. At that moment, the Beatles were the lead, so to take it away from them, they should do what a bebop musician does, appropriate their ideas and improvise on them. They started asking themselves, can you somehow fuse the power of rock and roll with the psychedelic experience to create the strongest experience of them all, an experience that will be even more powerful than Beatlemania? They started to plan it. Meanwhile, though, they got a golden opportunity to run another prank. On October 16th, a large rally against the Vietnam War was being organized at the University of California in Berkeley, the stronghold of the radical left. All of the leftist movements and folk singers were invited to take part in the event, and someone on the organizing committee, who has heard that the Merry Pranksters are some sort of seditious group, made the mistake of assuming that they are also on the left, and invited Kesey to speak. The pranksters enthusiastically accepted the invitation, and got to work. First, they painted their bus blood red, drew various militaristic signs on it, and armed it with toy cannons and guns. Secondly, they invited the Hells Angels, a notoriously violent biker gang that would occasionally hang out in their drug parties, to escort them to the event. When it was Kesey's turn to speak, the pranksters all got on stage with weird brass instruments and started to make a cacophony of noise, and Kesey, wearing a military helmet, played a patriotic tune on a mouth harmonica and had his say. A long line of speakers already spoke before him, and they all spoke in the superficial way that characterizes the radical left, and blamed their country for being the only party responsible for the war, inflaming the crowd through spreading hate to capitalism and the American way of life. Kesey, on the other hand, told the crowd that they are playing the same game as the people that they are against, and that he listened to all the previous speakers and couldn't tell the difference between them and Mussolini. If you really want to stop the wars, he said, you have to turn your back on this entire political game, and say fuck it. Like Bob Dylan, then, Kesey felt that there was actually no difference between the left and the right of his time, but they are both sides of the same coin. In his view, we need to stop defining ourselves as one side of this coin and find a new way to solve our problems. Within a month, the pranksters were ready to present a new way to the world, and the opportunity presented itself on December 4th, when the Rolling Stones performed in San Jose. The Rolling Stones came from London, and from the start they presented themselves as a radical alternative to the Beatles, as the embodiment of youth rebellion. Where the Beatles dressed rock and roll in a suit to make it more presentable, the Stones emphasized its wild anarchic and rebellious sides, and did all they could to terrify conformed society. By 1965, they were already challenging the Beatles for the title of the world's greatest rock and roll band, and their fans saw themselves as the representatives of liberation, the spearhead of the new generation. This time, the pranksters came prepared, hired a house in San Jose beforehand, and appropriated it for their means. When the youngsters left the Stones concert, they were met by a weird group of people in day-glow clothes, who handed them flyers asking, "Can you pass the acid test?" Being Stones fans, and thus regarding themselves as daring and free, many of them accepted the invitation, and headed towards the house to take the test. The acid test was Kesey's final conclusion from everything the pranksters went through in the past year. He realized that the only way to get people on the bus would be to get them to go through the psychedelic experience themselves, to understand it from within. Passing the acid test means going over the ledge and stepping into the experience, because only then will you be able to understand what the pranksters are trying to tell you. Timothy Leary preached that before you go through the experience you must undergo some preparation, and while you are in it you must listen to a guide that sits by you, but the pranksters despised such caution. For them, preparation and listening to a guide meant that you are operating according to someone else's script, instead of being in the moment. And so, they've allowed themselves to play Russian roulette with the minds of people, believing that what they are offering is worth the risk. When the guests stepped into the house, they found that there's a party going on, with a rock band playing rhythmic music to get everyone to dance, a band called the Grateful Dead. If you were thirsty from all the dancing, there was a big container of Kool-Aid in the corner, and the dancers drank from it, unaware that it was spiked with LSD, or acid as it was started being called. In a short while, they found themselves in a wondrous world of sounds and visions, created by the acid in their body but also by the atmosphere the pranksters generated. Stroboscopes projected a myriad of lights, tape recorders recorded everything and echoed it all back, and the Grateful Dead played improvised, liquid and loud rock music. Everybody danced, but under the influence, they did not dance the typical dances of the time, which were based on preconceived steps, but everyone danced freely, following their inner rhythms. This was a microcosm of the ideal world that Kesey saw in his mind, a world in which we are all part of one great cosmic dance, in which everyone does their thing and contributes to the whole. The acid test did to San Francisco's bohemian scene what Allen Ginsberg's Howl did to it a decade earlier. It gave it a new center around which everything gravitated. In January '66 it already hosted a 3-day festival that was called the Great Trips Festival, which hosted artists of many kinds, and climaxed in a large-scale acid test administered by the Merry Pranksters. The word began to spread, but it also caused moral panic in the general public, and caught the attention of the authorities. Within a few months, LSD was outlawed, and the police kept snooping around the bus. Kesey was eventually caught possessing drugs, and was facing a few years in jail. The pranksters, in response, ran another prank and staged his death, and by the time the media was onto the hoax, Kesey was already in Mexico. The pranksters tried to carry on without him, but without his leadership they soon fell apart. So, the Merry Pranksters succeeded in getting part of the world on the bus and into their movie, but their success came at the expense of their downfall. And yet, not everything fell apart. There was a part of them that remained standing, and soon became the new center of gravity in San Francisco. That part was the Grateful Dead.